It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the sun hung low in the sky and the air had just enough bite to make you pull your jacket tighter. The park was unusually quiet, its usual hum of joggers and dog walkers replaced by the whisper of leaves skittering across the concrete paths. I'd come for some peace and escape from the chaos of work and the constant ping of my phone, but the stillness was almost unnerving. As I walked, I noticed a lone park bench ahead. It sat under a cluster of skeletal trees whose leaves had already given up their battle against the season. Something about it felt out of place. There was no one else around, yet a crumpled piece of paper was left on the seat as though abandoned in haste. I hesitated. Normally, I wouldn't care about something so trivial, but the way the paper sat, there tauntingly out of place, itched at my curiosity. My footsteps slowed, the crunch of leaves beneath my boots the only sound. When I reached the bench, I glanced around, half expecting someone to appear and claim it. But no one came. The paper was folded several times, its edges soft and worn as though it had passed through many hands. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. Unfolding it revealed a list of handwritten rules, each written in a spidery script that seemed rushed yet meticulous. The rules. 1. If you find these rules, you are now a participant. 2. You must not destroy or discard this paper. 3. Do not leave the park before sunset. 4. Avoid looking directly at the man in the black hat. 5. If you hear whistling, do not run. 6. Once the streetlights turn on, find somewhere indoors to hide. 7. Do not speak to anyone who offers you help. They are not human. 8. If you survive until dawn, burn this paper immediately. I stared at the list, a lump forming in my throat. It had to be some kind of joke, a stupid prank, meant to scare gullible park goers. I flipped the paper over, hoping to find a punchline or even an advertisement for a haunted attraction, but the back was blank. Very funny, I muttered, stuffing the note into my pocket. The cold was starting to seep through my jacket, and I decided it was time to head back to my car. As I walked, the park seemed different. The air felt heavier, the shadows longer. It was as though the trees were leaning closer, their barren branches reaching like skeletal fingers. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but then I heard it, a faint whistle. It came from somewhere behind me, high-pitched and cheerful, like someone calling for a dog. I stopped mid-step, my heart kicking against my ribs. Just a coincidence, I muttered, though my voice sounded hollow. I kept walking, quickening my pace. The whistle came again, closer this time. The notes danced on the wind, impossibly clear despite the rustling leaves. It was the kind of sound that gets under your skin, sharp and deliberate. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing, just the empty path and the skeletal trees. But the rules echoed in my mind: if you hear whistling, do not run. My grip tightened on the strap of my bag, and I forced myself to move at a steady pace, each step measured. My breath puffed in little clouds as I tried to focus on anything other than the growing sense of dread gnawing at my chest. By the time I reached the edge of the park, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, and the first streetlights were flickering on. I cursed under my breath, suddenly aware that I had broken one of the rules: do not leave the park before sunset. I glanced at the note in my pocket, my fingers itching to pull it out, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it again. A sickly yellow glow spilled from the nearest streetlight, and I felt a sudden urge to move faster. That's when I saw him. Standing on the opposite side of the path, partially obscured by the shadows, was a man in a black hat. His silhouette was unnaturally tall, his limbs too long, like a puppet held together by fraying strings. I froze. The rules flashed through my mind: avoid looking directly at the man in the black hat. I averted my gaze, pretending I hadn't seen him. My skin prickled as I walked, the sensation of being watched burning into the back of my skull. I resisted the urge to turn around to confirm whether he was following me. The whistle came again, closer now, and the urge to run was overwhelming. My legs ached with the restraint of keeping my pace steady, my pulse roaring in my ears. The sound of footsteps joined the whistling, soft at first, then louder, heavier, matching my rhythm step for step. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Sweat slicked my palms despite the cold. My eyes darted to the surrounding buildings. There, windows dark and lifeless. Somewhere indoors, the rules had said, but there was nowhere to go. No shops, no houses, just an unbroken stretch of deserted street. Ahead, a small gazebo stood at the edge of the park. Its wooden frame was weathered and warped, but it was something. Somewhere, I made a beeline for it, my steps quickening despite my best efforts to stay calm. As I reached the gazebo, I dared to glance over my shoulder. The path behind me was empty. No man in a black hat. No whistler. Just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. From the shadows beneath the gazebo, a figure stepped forward. It was him, the man in the black hat. His face, or what should have been his face, was a void. A dark, hollow nothingness that seemed to absorb the dim light around him. His head tilted unnaturally, as though studying me. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the steps. Stay calm, I whispered to myself. But the rules offered no guidance for this. A void looking at him, how was that possible when he was right there? The whistling started again, louder now, and I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't coming from him. It was behind me, closing in fast. My instincts screamed to run, to bolt into the night and never look back. But the rules were clear. Do not run. I backed away slowly, my every movement deliberate. The man in the black hat didn't move, but his presence felt suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I reached the far side of the gazebo and stepped into the open air. The whistling stopped. For a moment, the world was silent. Then the streetlights flickered, and the darkness came alive. I stood frozen at the edge of the gazebo, the dim streetlights flickering erratically overhead. The shadows around me seemed to twist and writhe, as if alive. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my chest tight with panic. I knew I couldn't stay there, but every direction felt like a trap. The man in the black hat hadn't moved, yet his presence loomed, suffocating and oppressive. And then, the whistling returned. It was closer than before, and my heart sank as I realized it was coming from the direction I'd just come. The sound was sharp and playful, like a child's mocking tune, yet it carried an undertone that made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there trembling. But the rules were clear: do not run. Instead, I moved as calmly as I could, heading back toward the park path. My legs felt like they were wading through molasses, every step a monumental effort. The flickering lights made it harder to see, and I fought the urge to glance back at the gazebo. My hand brushed against the paper in my pocket, and I pulled it out with trembling fingers. The rules glared up at me, their spidery script tauntingly clear. Do not speak to anyone who offers you help. They are not human. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. Hey, you look lost. I stopped dead in my tracks. The voice came from a figure standing under the nearest streetlight, a woman in a hooded sweatshirt, her face obscured by shadow. She waved at me, her movements slow and deliberate. You need help? I can walk you to your car. Her voice was warm, almost soothing, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I didn't reply. She took a step forward, her movements too fluid, too precise. It's not safe out here. Come on. I'll help you. My grip tightened on the paper as the rule echoed in my mind: they are not human. No, thank you, I stammered, taking a step back. Her head tilted unnaturally, her smile widening in a way that felt wrong, like her face was stretching too far. Don't be rude, she said, her voice now tinged with something darker, something hungry. I turned and walked as quickly as I dared, my pulse thundering in my ears. Behind me, I heard her footsteps, unnervingly light, as though she wasn't walking but gliding over the ground. The trees loomed ahead, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. I plunged back into the park, the path barely visible in the faint light. The whistling had stopped, but the air felt charged with a suffocating tension, as though the whole world were holding its breath. I glanced at my watch. 9:15 p.m. Sunrise was still hours away. I needed to survive until dawn, but I had no idea how. My mind raced, replaying the rules over and over, searching for a loophole, a way out. Then I saw the lights. Up ahead, a small maintenance building stood at the edge of the park. A single bulb above the door flickered weakly, but it was enough to confirm it was real. Shelter. Indoors. Relief surged through me as I approached, my steps quickening. The door was unlocked, and I slipped inside, bolting it shut behind me. The interior was cramped and smelled of damp concrete, but it was a welcome change from the oppressive darkness outside. A single desk sat against the far wall, its surface cluttered with papers and an old radio. The room's only window was covered with grime, letting in just enough light to cast murky shadows on the walls. I collapsed into the chair by the desk, my hands shaking as I unfolded the rules again. My eyes scanned them, desperate for anything I'd missed. That's when I noticed it. At the bottom of the page, faint and smudged as though it had been erased and rewritten, was a ninth rule: do not trust the walls. They are listening. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around the room, the shadows on the walls seeming to shift and ripple in my peripheral vision. The faint hum of the building's electricity grew louder, almost like a whisper. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but where would I go? Outside, the man in the black hat and the whistler waited. Here, something else lurked, unseen but present. I turned to the radio, hoping it might provide some distraction or clue. I twisted the dial static, crackling through the speakers. For a moment, I thought I heard a voice low and distorted, but it was gone before I could make out the words. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the room. I froze, my heart hammering. The knock came again, louder this time, and I realized with dawning horror that it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the walls. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining until they filled the room. Words I couldn't understand, spoken in tones that were mocking and accusatory. I backed toward the door, my hands fumbling with the lock. As I turned the knob, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and I stumbled outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't look back as I ran, my legs pumping furiously. The whistling started again, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay in that building. I didn't stop until I reached a clearing in the park, the wide open space offering a false sense of safety. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the note still clutched tightly in my hand. I glanced around, half expecting the man in the black hat to appear or the woman from before to emerge from the shadows. But the clearing was empty, for now. The hours stretched on, an agonizing crawl of time punctuated by the distant sound of footsteps, faint whispers, and the occasional flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, I collapsed to my knees, tears streaming down my face. I had survived. With shaking hands, I pulled out the note. The final rule was clear: burn this paper. Immediately. I reached into my pocket for a lighter, fumbling with it until a small flame flickered to life. I held the note over the flame, watching as the edges blackened and curled. As the last of the paper turned to ash, the whispers stopped. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight lifted. But as I stood there, staring at the pile of ash in my hand, a terrible thought struck me. The rules were gone. But what if that didn't mean the game was over? What if I had only made room for the next player? Could you follow the rules well enough to escape being hunted? Let us know how you'd handle this nightmare. I moved to Ashbourne to escape. The relentless grind of city life had worn me down, and the quiet, tree-lined streets of the little town seemed like the perfect retreat. People were friendly and that way small-town folks always are polite but distant. It suited me just fine. I wasn't looking for late-night bar crawls or neighborhood cookouts. I just wanted peace. But the bridge, that was something else. I'd spotted it on my second day, just a 5-minute walk from the cottage I was renting. The thing looked like it was ripped out of a Gothic postcard, wooden planks weathered gray by years of neglect, a wrought iron railing that curled like skeletal fingers, and an eerie mist that seemed to cling to it every morning. It crossed a narrow gorge, connecting my side of town to the main strip, and while it was picturesque in daylight, it transformed into something menacing when the sun went down. I didn't think much of it at first until people started warning me about it. It began with the cashier at the little grocery store downtown. I'd mentioned how creepy the bridge looked at night, trying to make conversation. She'd gone pale, her hands freezing mid-scan. "Don't cross it after dark," she muttered, eyes darting toward the window as though the bridge might overhear. When I asked her why, she just shook her head. "You don't want to know." That was just the start. Later, at the cafe, overheard a table of old-timers talking about the rules. Their voices were low, but the walls of that place were thin, and I couldn't help but catch pieces of the conversation. ... Can't whistle, no matter what. It hears you if you do. Don't stop walking. That's when it reaches for you. And if you hear something behind you, you never look back. Their solemnity was absurd. It sounded like the kind of ghost story you'd tell around a campfire. I laughed to myself and left with my coffee, chalking it up to small-town superstition. Every place like this had its quirks, right? The final warning came from my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway. She was one of the few people I'd grown to like, a sweet, spry woman who brought me muffins. We were chatting over the fence, and her face immediately darkened. "It's not superstition," she said flatly. "Those rules are the reason we're still alive." I tried to laugh it off, but she grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me, Emily. Do not break the rules. Do not test it. It isn't a joke." Her words lingered with me longer than I'd admit, but still, I didn't believe her. Why would I? The rational part of me dismissed it as nonsense, a story born out of boredom and isolation. Ashbourne didn't have movie theaters or shopping malls, of course they'd come up with something spooky to pass the time. That's how I found myself on the bridge one night, alone. It was an accident, really. I'd lost track of time while writing at the library, and by the time I stepped outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon. I could have called a cab, but it felt silly to spend money when I could walk the 10 minutes home. It was just a bridge. The night air was cold, the kind that creeps under your jacket and settles into your bones. The mist was heavier than usual, swirling around my feet like it had a mind of its own. I hesitated at the edge of the bridge, remembering Mrs. Calloway's voice, "Do not test it." But that's exactly what I was doing, wasn't I? Testing it, proving to myself and to this town that there was nothing to fear but fear itself. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the first plank. The wood creaked under my boots, loud in the quiet night. I walked briskly, my eyes fixed on the opposite side. The mist made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, but the faint glow of the streetlights gave me just enough to guide my way. I was halfway across when I heard it. A giggle, soft, high-pitched, and unmistakably childlike. It floated through the air like it was coming from everywhere, and nowhere all at once. I stopped walking. The second giggle was louder, closer. My heart began to pound as I scanned the mist, my breath forming clouds in the cold. There was no one there, just the empty bridge stretching out in front of me. And then I remembered the rules. Don't stop walking. I forced myself to take a step, then another, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The giggles grew louder, and with them came something else, footsteps. Not mine. They were lighter, faster, and they didn't match my pace. Panic bubbled up in my chest. My rational mind screamed at me to turn around, to see what was behind me. But Mrs. Calloway's warning rang louder, "Do not look back." The footsteps quickened, almost playful, as if they were daring me to break the rule. Every nerve in my body begged me to run, but I couldn't. I was too afraid of what might happen if I stopped moving, if I broke another rule. I don't know how I made it across. By the time I reached the other side, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. The giggle stopped the moment my feet touched solid ground, and when I finally looked back, the bridge was empty, but the mist wasn't. It seemed thicker now, roiling like a living thing, and I could have sworn I saw a shadow standing in the center of the bridge, watching me. I stumbled the rest of the way home, slamming the door behind me. That night I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Because for the first time since moving to Ashbourne, I realized the rules weren't just superstition. They were a warning. The next morning I told myself it had all been in my head. Lack of sleep, the mist, the isolation. I'd let my imagination run wild. That's all it was. But deep down I knew better. The day passed in a haze. I stayed inside, kept the curtains drawn, and jumped at every little noise. Rationality tried to reassure me, but the memory of those footsteps, the ones that didn't match my own, kept replaying in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear them, and, worse, feel them, that unnerving sensation of being followed. By dusk, I was a wreck. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I proved to myself the bridge was just a bridge. I had to go back, to cross it again, to prove it wasn't some cursed gateway to the other side. Armed with a flashlight and sheer determination, I set out. As I approached the bridge, the world seemed to grow quieter. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves fell away, replaced by an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The mist was back, thicker this time, swirling lazily around the edges of the bridge like it had been waiting for me. I hesitated at the edge, gripping the flashlight tightly. This time I would follow the rules. No stopping, no whistling, no looking back. I repeated them in my head like a mantra as I stepped onto the first plank. The wood groaned beneath my boots, the sound amplified by the oppressive silence. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the bridge were amplifying them, mocking me. I kept my eyes fixed forward, refusing to look into the mist that seemed to creep closer with every step. The cold came first. Not a natural chill, but an unnatural, bone-deep cold that seeped through my jacket and made my breath hitch. Then came the shadows. At first they were subtle, flickers at the edges of my vision, just enough to make me doubt what I was seeing. But as I walked, they grew bolder. They slid across the planks, long and distorted, their movements jerky and unnatural. I told myself they were tricks of the mist, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, waiting. Then came the footsteps. I heard them faintly at first, blending with the rhythm of my own. But as I kept walking, it became clear they were out of sync. Where my steps were steady, these were erratic, like someone or something stumbling just behind me. I wanted to stop. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to confirm I was alone. But I knew better now. Instead, I quickened my pace, my breathing shallow as the footsteps matched my urgency. For every step I took, they took two. The giggle came next. It was faint at first, like a child laughing far away. But as I neared the center of the bridge, it grew louder, high-pitched and echoing. It bounced around me, making it impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. My chest tightened as my legs threatened to freeze. Keep walking. Just keep walking. I whispered the words under my breath, my voice barely audible over the laughter. But the bridge had other plans. The planks beneath my feet seemed to shift, creaking louder than before, as though they were protesting my presence. And the shadows, oh God, the shadows, they weren't just flickering anymore. They were crawling. Out of the corners of my eyes, I saw them stretching unnaturally across the railings, their forms fluid and inhuman. One of them slithered forward, reaching for the edge of the beam of light. From my flashlight, recoiling the moment it touched the glow, the giggles turned into whispers. Stay with us. The words were soft and disjointed, like dozens of voices speaking at once, each one slightly out of sync. My knees nearly buckled, but I forced myself to move faster. I had to get off this bridge. I had to. The first tug came out of nowhere. Something invisible grabbed the hem of my jacket, yanking hard enough to make me stumble. I nearly fell, catching myself on the railing. The cold metal burned against my palms, and when I pulled them away, they were red and raw, as if I'd touched dry ice. Stay. Stay, the voices chanted, growing louder, overlapping into a cacophony of desperate pleas. The laughter returned, cruel and mocking, as I felt another tug, this time at my backpack. I couldn't take it anymore. I broke into a sprint. The bridge stretched on forever. No matter how fast I ran, the other side didn't seem to get any closer. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I couldn't stop. The footsteps behind me became a stampede, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. Invisible hands clawed at my arms, my shoulders, my back. Shadows darted in front of me, twisting into grotesque shapes, their edges sharp and jagged. I shut my eyes and ran blindly, tears streaming down my face. Suddenly the cold lifted. I stumbled off the last plank and onto solid ground, collapsing in a heap on the dirt path. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. My flashlight lay on the ground beside me, its beam flickering weakly, casting long shadows that danced around me. When I looked back at the bridge, it was empty. The mist had receded, and the wooden planks looked as old and weathered as they had during the day. But I knew better now. I knew what was lurking there, waiting for the next fool to break the rules. That night, I locked every door and window in the house, drawing every curtain and leaving every light on. But it didn't help. The whispers followed me home. They started faintly, just outside the windows, soft voices calling my name. When I didn't respond, they moved closer. By midnight, they were inside the house. The shadows were next. They flickered at the edges of my vision, creeping across the walls and ceilings. I'd whip my head around, but they'd always vanish just before I could catch them. And then, the giggles. I knew they weren't coming from the bridge anymore. They were here, with me. What would you do if the whispers followed you home? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd had the kind of day that made me hate my life more than usual. Work was a blur of meetings, and deadlines I barely managed to meet. My boss had been on me all day about an overdue project, and by the time I left the office, my brain felt like it was running on fumes. All I wanted was to get home, sink into my couch, and drown out the world with some mindless TV. The subway station was its usual mix of chaos and monotony, commuters staring at their phones, Muffled announcements cutting through the air, the faint smell of grease and damp concrete. I didn't even notice the stranger at first. He was just part of the crowd, another forgettable face in a sea of them. But then he stepped directly into my path. I barely avoided walking into him, muttering a half-hearted apology before trying to sidestep. He didn't move. His hand shot out not to grab me, but to press something into my palm. A piece of folded paper. His eyes met mine for just a second, wide and frantic, like he was trying to communicate something he couldn't put into words. Then he turned and disappeared into the throng of people before I could say anything. I stared at the paper in my hand, confused and a little annoyed. My first instinct was to toss it in the nearest trash can, but curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded it as I stepped onto the train, the doors hissing shut behind me. The note was handwritten in hurried, uneven letters, like whoever wrote it had been in a panic. 1. Don't answer your phone between 11 p.m. and 12 a.m., no matter who calls. 2. If you hear footsteps behind you on an empty street, don't turn around. 3. If a stranger smiles at you for too long, smile back but don't break eye contact until they leave. 4. Don't sleep in total darkness. Keep at least one light on. At the bottom, in a messier scrawl, was one final warning. If you break these rules, they will know. I laughed under my breath. A prank, obviously. Some weirdo trying to mess with me. It wasn't even clever, just the kind of thing you'd see in a bad horror movie. Still, I folded the note back up and slipped it into my pocket. Maybe I'd show it to a friend later for a laugh. The train rattled and screeched as it sped toward my stop, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. The stranger's expression lingered in my mind, those wide, frantic eyes. There was something desperate about him, something that didn't fit with the idea of a harmless prank. By the time I got home, I'd mostly forgotten about the note. I kicked off my shoes, threw my bag on the couch, and microwaved a frozen dinner. The routine grounded me, made me feel normal. Again, the city was full of strange people and stranger encounters. This was just another one to laugh about and forget. Around 10:30, I got into bed. I set my alarm for 6 a.m., checked my phone for any last messages, and turned out the light. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, I felt a twinge of unease. Rule number 4 floated through my mind: don't sleep in total darkness. Shook my head, annoyed at myself for even thinking about it. I wasn't about to let some stupid note dictate how I lived my life. At 11 sharp, my phone buzzed. I groaned, reaching for it on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months. Matt. We'd been close in college, but life had gotten in the way, and we hadn't spoken in years. My finger hovered over the screen, ready to answer. But then I remembered the first rule: don't answer your phone between 11 p.m. and 12 a.m. I hesitated. It was ridiculous, just a stupid note. But the memory of that stranger's face made me pause. My phone buzzed again. A text popped up. Hey, it's Matt. Are you there? I need to talk to you. I the note to call Matt and see what was going on. But something stopped me. My pulse quickened as the phone buzzed. Again. Another text: why aren't you answering? I'm outside. Outside? I threw off the covers and rushed to the window, my heart pounding. The street was empty. No sign of Matt. The phone buzzed again, the sound sharp and grating in the silence. This time I turned it off. I didn't want to see what the next message would say. As I sat in the dark, gripping the phone with shaking hands, I realized something. I should have left a light on. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes made me jump. I kept expecting to hear the knock on my door, to see Matt or whatever was pretending to be him waiting on the other side. But nothing came. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head. I was stressed, overtired, and overthinking things. But when I grabbed my jacket to leave for work, the note fell out of the pocket. I stared at it for a long moment, its simple warnings now feeling less absurd and more ominous. The second incident happened 2 nights later. I was walking home late after staying at the office to finish a project. The streets were quiet, the usual buzz of the city dulled by the late hour. As I turned onto my block, I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was a city, after all. People were always coming and going. But these footsteps were wrong. They didn't match the rhythm of mine. They were too close when they should have been far away, too soft when they should have been loud. My stomach nodded as the second rule flashed in my mind: if you hear footsteps behind you on an empty street, don't turn around. Run. I quickened my pace, my ears straining to catch the sound. The footsteps quickened too, keeping pace with me. I clenched my fists, fighting the overwhelming urge to turn and see who or what was there. The logical part of me screamed that this was ridiculous, that there was probably just some poor soul heading the same way as me. But the sound of those footsteps didn't feel human. When I reached my apartment building, I bolted inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I pressed my back against it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped, not fading into the distance, not echoing further down the street. They just stopped. I peered through the peephole, my heart pounding. The street was empty, completely still. Even the usual hum of distant traffic seemed muted. That night, I didn't sleep. Again. The third rule came into play the following day. I was sitting in a cafe, trying to work. The lack of sleep had caught up to me, and I thought a change of scenery might help me focus. The place was busy, the hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes creating a comforting background noise. For the first time in days, I almost felt normal. Then I noticed him, a man sitting at a table across the room, staring at me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, maybe he was zoning out or looking at someone behind me. But his gaze never wavered. He didn't blink. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, too forced, as if he were imitating something he didn't quite understand. My skin prickled as the third rule surfaced: if a stranger smiles at you for too long, smile back. But don't break eye contact until they leave. I tried to ignore him, but his grin widened, stretching unnaturally. My throat tightened as I forced myself to meet his gaze, plastering on a weak smile of my own. His eyes were dark, empty, as if they didn't belong to a person at all. I held the smile, my jaw aching, my hands trembling under the table. I didn't dare blink. He didn't move, didn't speak, just kept grinning, his head tilting ever so slightly to one side, then the other. The room seemed to grow quieter, the other customers fading into the background. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stood. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the cafe, his movements jerky, almost mechanical. I sat there for several minutes, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally dared to look away, I realized my coffee had gone cold. I thought about the note constantly after that. The rules weren't just abstract warnings, they were a lifeline, a fragile barrier between me and whatever was closing in. But the scariest part wasn't the rules themselves. It was the line at the bottom: if you break these rules, they will. No, I didn't want to know what happened if I broke them. I was terrified I'd find out. That night, the last rule came into play. I'd bought a small desk lamp earlier in the day, determined to keep my room from plunging into total darkness. It cast a warm, comforting glow over the corner of my bedroom as I got ready for bed. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, if I followed the rules, I could get through this. Maybe this nightmare would pass. I fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion finally catching up to me. But at some point during the night, I woke up. The room was pitch black. The lamp was off. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up the darkness. The bulb in the lamp had shattered, shards of glass scattered across the nightstand. My heart pounded. As I remembered the last rule: don't sleep in total darkness. Keep at least one light on. I reached for the switch on the wall, but before I could turn it on, I heard it. A faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. It was coming from the corner of the room, the same corner where the lamp had been. I froze, my phone shaking in my hand. The light from the screen barely illuminated the edge of the bed, leaving the rest of the room shrouded in shadows. But I could feel it. Something was there, watching me. The rustling grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My breath caught as I pressed myself against the headboard, my fingers gripping the phone like a lifeline. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the bed. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and I could feel a presence looming over me. "Why aren't you following the rules?" a voice whispered, low and guttural. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The presence leaned closer, the weight of it pressing down on me. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I would pass out. Then the light came on. The ceiling light flooded the room, chasing the shadows into the corners. The weight lifted, and The air felt lighter, breathable again. But when I looked at the corner where the lamp had been, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single blackened handprint, seared into the wall. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I packed a bag and left the apartment. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay there. The note was still in my pocket. Its warnings etched into my mind. I haven't broken a rule since. But sometimes late at night, I still hear the footsteps. And I don't think they're just in my head. What do you think the stranger's note really meant? Was it a warning? Or something darker? Let us know your theory.